The availability of discretionary access to virtually limitless information has given those who choose to the ability to see past the false reality projected by the legacy media and other controlled institutions. This isn't to say they see beyond content itself, but rather that they can see content apart from what's controlled by corporate interests. There are enough ways to get other sources of information beyond the ones that are filtered through conglomerates and their captured institutions. Additionally, the ability for people to spread a message online provides a way to know other perspectives on a real event, which exposes the spin injected into the narrative by official channels. What's called the golden age of the internet persisted until its effects and trajectory became apparent to moneyed interests who have been trying to consolidate all online outlets into their control. They want a return to the old days when they were the gatekeepers, when they could get most of the eyeballs with just a handful of television channels and radio stations, some big newspapers. There was the appearance back then of more editorial independence and less pronounced an agenda. When there was just a handful of outlets, it didn't look so conspicuous when they tended to agree, but now there's just so many that when they all agree, it seems surreal. It's obvious that they're all getting their information from the same place. The problem for the controllers of the mainstream narrative has been that while the industry has consolidated, the technology that drove that consolidation has simultaneously, and they hope temporarily, multiplied the number of outlets to one that's beyond their control. The strategy now seems to be outlawing disagreement and excluding dissenting outlets from search results, relegating dissenters to jail cells and the dark web. The dominant narrative is essentially a Malthusian one. The impetus to control doesn't anticipate or purport to anticipate a technology that will alleviate these problems they articulate. But in the past, several Malthusian problems have been addressed by technological advancements. There have been agricultural advancements that have thwarted the iron law of wages, and there have been other technologies that have massively increased the efficiency of extraction of minerals through different techniques such as fracking and drilling sideways. Instead, the solution of the oligarchic Malthusian is to shackle and demoralize the population, destroying the cultural base that would likely have otherwise produced a solution. The neo-Malthusians think machines will make most of us useless eaters and will additionally solve all the big problems. But it seems like AI can only work what we know already, and additionally it seems to be creating error due to its intake of embellished AI-generated content. It has an endogeneity problem of sorts. It's like it's playing a game of telephone with itself, where the accuracy of its output drifts ever farther from the human-generated statements of fact that it started with. It spirals off into a fantasy of its own making, based on small errors with each iteration of information processed. Perhaps there'll be a workaround for this, or perhaps there already is. But the point is that the neo-Malthusian view is that we need to start kicking people off the airplane to prevent a crash. That we need, as a species, to go into some austerity mode. It doesn't have to be more sinister or nuanced than that. That alone is sufficiently damnable, as it's simply one group of people killing off another through fifth-generation warfare. In light of its patron's environmentalist veneer, the irony of the incumbent monetary system is that it requires unending growth. The price level is a function of goods relative to dollars chasing them. Money is lent into existence, and it is put to use in things that create value. If it does that, and the loans create value, the ratio of dollars to goods remains somewhat stable. But for every dollar that's lent without creating value, it increases the amount of dollars relative to the amount of goods they chase, thus causing inflation, assuming a constant velocity of money. No fiat currency regime has lasted beyond a century. In the case of the United States, ours has recently crossed the half-century mark since Nixon closed the gold window. With a fiat money system, the temptation to plunder is too great. And the fact is that while the principle of a loan lends money into existence from nothing, the interest that's required to fully pay it back is not created by this process. So there is never enough money in circulation to pay off the amount of debt that created it. Therefore, the money supply in a fiat system is a bubble that must ever grow, or else it will collapse. So these Malthusians advocate for a money system that requires unending growth to not crash. That has environmental implications to the extent that the amount of goods and services must ever expand to accommodate the ever-expanding money supply. It more rapidly converts the natural world into goods and services. This is why the Malthusian environmentalists are talking out of both sides of their mouths as they fly in private jets to environmental conferences. Their monetary system whips humanity into the task of paying off a debt that not only can never be repaid for a lack of currency to do it, but must also ever grow so as to not collapse into a deflationary depression. It's no matter to them whether the ubiquity of their private jet lifestyle would require 10 Earths to support. It's all a facade. Another product of the monetary system is when inflation gets out of control, it has a demoralizing effect in that it puts people into desperate situations where they do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, such as sell themselves. And inflation can be generated at the discretion of the central bank. It's like Milton Friedman said, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. When media-promoted pseudoscience prophecies do not come to pass, it gets memory hold. These prophecies are far enough out into the future always that by the time they don't happen, nobody's really talking about them anymore. The one environmental thing you don't hear about quite so often is habitat destruction itself, the conversion of the natural environment into the built environment. It's rather more often about managing some commodity-like output of human activity, something that can be bought and sold on a market and turned into a derivatives casino. Otherwise, it has no appeal. It's just a big financial grift. Far more concerning is the destruction of forests. But I didn't make this video to talk about environmental science, so please don't blast me in the comments section. This part is about the propensity to commodify things for the purpose of financial exploit. The big players in industry always have quarterly numbers to make, and those numbers can only go up, else consolidation. Therefore, people must buy. Because there's never enough currency to pay off all the loans, the failure of business and subsequent consolidation is a feature of the system. It's designed to consolidate industry and therefore power, to the extent that there is corruption to facilitate the exchange. There are a number of ways to make people buy things. An exigent circumstance can be a windfall for the one who is first with a solution. I can't even speculate on the number of man-made problems that have been cooked up as a way to sell man-made solutions. Look at advertising. It does exactly that, just in the minds of the audience. It creates a mental problem, a need, and then proposes a solution. To the extent that many of the problems are made up by editors and captured scientists, the news of it is something like an advertisement of fear, that the world is going to end if you don't obey. War is another way to force purchases while killing off useless eaters. We, who are essentially private citizens, are completely disconnected from the strategies that are unfolding at the behest of public figures, likely at the direction of many private ones. Another way to motivate consumption is to intensify people's unconscious identification with form, such as in identity politics. It creates a fear that calls for relief and distraction, which requires more economic activity. Beyond this, it creates the low-trust society in which people will accept control from above for fear of each other. They're so identified with their superficial features and positions, their mental positions, that they're constantly in a mental war with imaginary figures. In an earlier video, I referenced how the sovereign is a political unit with zero redundancy, and that if the body is killed, so is the regime, essentially. That reality justifies the greatest amount of paranoia on the part of leadership. And this idea works along a continuum. The fewer people in charge, the more vulnerable to decapitation they are, and therefore the more ruthless they will be in the protecting of their power. The king is the most extreme case of this. If you look around the world in the time since the advent of mass media, you see more censorship as the power structure of a country becomes more concentrated. It's an expression of the aforementioned continuum where the monarch is the most extreme example of the impetus to hold power at all costs. When there are fewer decision makers due to power concentration, not only the greater the power to influence the narrative, but there's a far greater motivation to do it. We're in an age of censorship, but there are ever more platforms arising to get around it. The solution for the incumbent powers has been to simply outlaw certain views. In our mother country, people are being given timeouts for wrongthink. The fact that this occurs in what's been called or is called the free world doesn't excuse it or sanitize it. They're acting just like those who they criticize. But those who perpetrate such violations against free speech, they justify it by claiming the righteousness of their views. They're the good guys, and that to dissent is to commit violence. Even if the forbidden speech was based on the truth, the fact that it threatens the official narrative makes its public utterance a jailable offense. It takes a considerable concentration of power to physically incarcerate people for unpopular speech, because when power is spread more widely, there are enough wise people included among the decision makers to recognize the danger of outlawing speech. So this means there are so few people in power that there's nobody wise enough to see this. There's not enough moral courage to do anything about it. If there were more people in the power structure, there would be someone who could think about the world it leads to. When power is in too few hands, the incentive to protect the regime is so great that the truth must be ignored to protect the lives within it. And that can really snowball. It's like parallel lines. If they're a little off to start with, they just get wider and wider as you go through space. And it's the same way with the deviation from the truth. The lies just have to keep building on themselves, and the distance of the official narrative from the truth becomes so great that just the weight of the inefficiency of carrying the lie eventually comes crashing down. And the longer the weight, the longer that persists, the greater the crash that will occur in the correction when everything returns to the truth. The truth eventually asserts itself. Surprisingly, few people question what's put forth by this small group of people as reality. If you're a person who resisted getting the experiment back in 2021, you realize that the majority of people believe the official narrative enough to have rolled the dice with their lives. You likely also realize how many of the things that were said by the officials were lies. For example, the idea that these things were sterilizing. No, they were not sterilizing. But a lot of outrageous behavior was predicated on that notion. People were violated and lost their livelihoods over that lie. But sorry, nobody saved Grandma. Chomsky literally said people should be put in camps for not complying. If you look at the maps that track the Coof today, you'll see a conspicuous lack of cases in the places where there were fewer things administered, so to speak. I'm just going to give you my intuition on this, though there may be data to support it. The thing that they administered focused selection pressure on a very small part of the pathogen, which is a part that's also prone to mutation. If you put that much selection pressure on it, it's just going to mutate. So if you were to forego the experiment, you were putting yourself at a certain risk, as a novel virus is a kind of bottleneck in the population. Some people just aren't going to make it because a certain percent are going to react badly to an unknown protein. But if you survived the thing without the experiment, your immunity is multifaceted and keys in on parts of the virus that don't mutate so often. This is why we still have many cases, no herd immunity really. Not like it is in Papua New Guinea and many parts of Africa. They have a true herd immunity and a lower caseload as a result. I didn't get the thing, and I got a real bad case of what it purports to prevent, and I haven't had it since. It's been years. Meanwhile, just about everybody I know who got the thing has been sick several times. I don't blame anybody for getting it. I just never wanted to be harassed for not getting it. Our injectable attempts to prevent this thing are driving its mutation. It's not the abstainers who are the variant factories, but rather the partakers. I'm not so sure how relevant this is anymore. I really hope it's past us, but the amount of lies that were put forth are unfortunately less visible to those who complied. When you have that much power stacked up against you, you really never forget it. But if you went along with it, you never really noticed it. Even though recently with the election of the Orange Man, it appears that people are no longer believing everything they see on the screen, the question remains if the majority of those will see this as a moment when the experts were wrong, or if they'll figure out that everyone has a price, or some damning piece of information against them, and that the experts are puppets. There was a generation that believed anything in print And we seem to be the generation that believes anything on a screen, unless it's AI, and assuming it came from an official source. Anything that deviates from the corporate infomercial reality that forms people's minds is called conspiracy theory, which we know is a term created by a certain agency to discredit anything that doesn't fit with the narrative. It's possible that there's a critical mass that must be achieved to expose the incumbent power's lack of credibility. The shift in political winds in the United States may be a bellwether for that. There were enough people concerned with the direction that the puppeteers were trying to move things. Perhaps we're past the point where the controllers still think they can dispose of all the dissenters without being disposed of themselves. I have considered the possibility that the magnitude and number of crimes committed by powerful people are such that to bring them all to justice would near completely decimate the ranks of those who hold most of the money and power.